You're listening to Interzone Pod with me, Gareth Jelley, the editor of Interzone. Find out more about Interzone at interzone.press and read stories for free at interzone.digital. Joining me on the show today is author Abi Curtis. Hello, Abi. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Hi, Gareth. Really nice to be on the show.
I wanted to start by just asking you to, could you introduce yourself to listeners a little bit? Sort of who you are. Who is Abi?
Of course. Yeah, so I'm a professor of creative writing at York St John University, which is in York in the UK. I teach mostly master's level and MFA students all kinds of creative writing. I have been a writer for quite a number of years, I guess, probably about 20 years, 25 years, something like that. I started out writing a lot of poetry, and I still love writing poetry, but I moved towards writing fiction about 10 years ago or so. I had a novel called Water and Glass that came out in, I think it was 2013 that came out, no, 2017, which was kind of a speculative fiction novel, and that was my first novel, and I write short stories, and I've so in latter years I've got more into writing fiction, I guess, and I write a little bit of non-fiction type stuff as well as part of my job too.
And when you were growing up, were you also reading a mix of poetry and prose? Were you drawn to both?
Yeah, I think growing up I was very interested in reading. I would eat my breakfast in the morning and read the whole cereal packet. I was that kind of a kid. So yeah, probably a bit of anything and everything, really. Anything I could get my hands on, anything I was introduced to at school, or anything I was bought, or anything that was in the house. Poetry I probably came to a bit later when I did my master's degree, which was at Exeter University with a great poet called Andy Brown, who introduced me to a lot of formal poetry, and then I got very into poetry. But I had always loved at school, writing short stories, writing fictions. I was very much a daydreamer, I think, as a child, so that was a way of daydreaming for me. Writing was a kind of form of daydreaming, as Freud would tell us, So in his lovely little essay, Creative Writers and Daydreaming, he sort of says the only adults that can get away with daydreaming are writers. Yeah.
And I think on your York profile, it mentions that you have an interest in psychology. And is that something you kind of track through all of your work?
Yeah, I guess I do. I think when I was thinking about uni initially, when I was doing my A-levels, I was torn between doing like a kind of English literature degree or a psychology degree. And I went to Sussex Uni, which at the time, sort of late 90s, you could combine a few different interests. It was quite interdisciplinary. I lent more towards literature and culture. But yeah, I've always been really interested in psychology. I did my PhD on Freud and literature. But I think in a way, lots of writers are really interested in human psychology. They kind of use their writing to explore it, I suppose. But yeah, definitely there's a parallel universe where I'm a psychologist. Definitely. I'm fascinated by human behavior, human interaction, the way the mind works, the way creativity works, all those sorts of things. Yeah, and I guess that probably does come out in my writing to some extent.
In The Glass Delusion, your second poetry collection, there's a psychic octopus.
Yes.
I'm getting this from the blurb, not from having seen it, sadly.
Yes.
An orchestra of insects, an enchanted version of Essex, and a poem that sounds wonderful called "Marrying Doctor Who."
Yes.
And one reviewer said, reading it is like getting the ability to read particularly beautiful, strange photographs, which I love, as a kind of comment in a review. And it made me think about the moment in the Headland with the auto stereogram.
Yes.
And the wonderful line about seeing different kinds of truths and shapes in the world. And I wonder, do you remember when you first sort of really felt the power of the written word to not just to imagine new worlds, but to change the way you saw the world?
I think I do. This is odd, I suppose, but I read a sort of, I think what would be called a young adult novel now. It was less of a category when I was a young adult. There was a book that I read maybe when I was about 10. It's kind of hazy, the age that I was, but a book called The World Around the Corner by a New Zealand writer called Morris something. I can't quite remember. I did a hunt for this book last year because I couldn't remember the name of the book and I couldn't remember the name of the author, but I could remember a line from the book that I had found absolutely captivating. And it was something to do with it was raining and the raindrops were as large as sparrows' eggs and as warm as tea.
Oh, wow.
And I read, so I read that line maybe 35 years ago or something. And I read that line and I remember thinking, this is how powerful writing can be. And it doesn't even have to be convoluted, overly sophisticated, highbrow. But if you choose the right words to describe something, you can really take a reader to a place that is beyond where they are. And it's kind of a magical realist novel, actually, but that part of the novel very early on is in the sort of ordinary world before the female character is kind of transported into a more sort of fantasy world. And that part of the novel is the part I found most captivating, just the description of the world around her, the ordinary world around her, but through this amazing kind of point of view. And I think that might be the moment I decided I wanted to be a writer.
Okay.
Just reading that line. Yeah.
That's great that you can pinpoint that.
Yeah, I've got a weirdly good memory for things like that. But then I had to go on a hunt. I went on this hunt for the book. I had to try and figure out what the book was called. And I got myself a secondhand copy of it. And there it was, the exact line, exactly as I remembered it.
Wow.
Still in the book. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Great that you found it. Great. I mean, it's so often with that kind of story, you don't find it. You have this memory, but just trying to pin it down to a particular thing is tricky. So it's great that you found it.
Yeah, I did eventually. Yeah. And yeah, I think perhaps I'm very interested in visual art as well. And I made Dolores in the Headland an artist, a painter, because I wanted her to be the sort of person that really noticed the detail of the sort of changing landscape and the changing colours of the sky. And, she's in a coastal town. So the fact that she can see the alien in the headland when others can't is partly to do with her way of kind of looking at the world in that creative way, I guess.
You mentioned the kind of visual, the kind of visual side of things, and I wonder when you decided to write it in present tense, was that part of it? Was there something filmic or more immediate about it being in present tense?
Yeah, so I guess Morgan's narrative, so Dolores' son's narrative, is technically in the present tense. Dolores' narrative is written as a diary, so some of it's kind of in the past tense because she's looking back over the day's events, but I think also it is kind of very immediate because it's like what's just happened to her. I think writing in the present tense is a real challenge. I don't think it always works. I think it's always quite hard to sustain. But for her narrative, I was very much inspired by Derek Jarman. So I should say that the Headlands landscape is a fictionalized version of Dungeness, which is a coastal community on the Kent coast, a real place in Kent on the coast, which is a very kind of unusual landscape. There are 2 power stations there. It's quite sparsely populated. There's it's supposed to be sort of Britain's only desert. It has these sound mirrors from the war. It's quite an unusual landscape. But Derek Jarman, the artist and filmmaker, has this iconic little house there called Prospect Cottage, or he did when he was alive. And in the late 1980s, he wrote a diary, a kind of journal / diary, of all about living in the cottage, the kind of changing seasons, his ideas for his art, and then lots of kind of political stuff around, the AIDS crisis and stuff around his friends and all of that. But the parts of the diary that I really loved were the very simple things about his garden that he was cultivating there, and the changing landscape, changing seasons, the bleakness of the sort of view from the cottage. So Dolores's diary is inspired by that diary in many ways. Sometimes you'll get a 3-page entry, sometimes you'll get 3 lines. I saw a fox outside the window today. So one of the reasons I chose to write her narrative in that way is because I was really interested in how much kind of story you can get out of a kind of very intimate sort of journalistic journal type form. And then Morgan, her son, sort of, 35, 40 years later, comes back to the headland to deal with her funeral after she's died, and he discovers the diary. So he's reading the diary that we're reading as readers, if you like. So one of the reasons why his narrative is in the present tense is because he's experiencing that diary now, and it's kind of affecting his lived experience now, even though it is kind of a historical document. So we get the intimacy of him reading her in a sense. So it wouldn't have worked, I don't think, to have his experience in the past tense. It needed to be like we've sat down and we're privy to this personal diary as readers. So it's a very long answer, but that's why it's written in the way that it is.
It's a fascinating answer, and I think you mentioned that it's hard to sustain, but I think you do sustain it, and it's and it works because as you describe it, kind of fits kind of what's what we're experiencing. Yeah. So that does work. My next question was about place. Actually, it was about Dungeness and the Dun poem, which is written on the wall. Is that right?
Yeah. So Jarman had part of that poem engraved on the side of, and it's kind of embossed. It's like little solid wooden letters, I think, that are sort of pinned onto the side of the house and then painted in the black sort of tarring that the rest of the house is painted in. So the Dun poem is kind of beautiful because it's like, try to outrun your mortality, I suppose, in a weird sort of way. But it's also the story is partly about time and about I suppose the more science fiction side of the story is about the idea that humans experience time as linear, but that might potentially be a sort of limitation of human perception. So I got very interested in Carlo Rovelli's work on time. So Carlo Rovelli, if people don't know, is an Italian physicist, quantum physicist, who writes kind of popular science books about quantum reality, quantum time, and it's very accessible. So I'm not a physicist and I don't understand the maths, and it's quite hard stuff. But if people are interested in that, he's very accessible and quite a moving writer, in many ways. And I was really interested in this idea. I was sort of blown away by this idea that we experience time as linear because of our limitations of perception, that in fact it's not linear. Everything kind of exists all the time at once. and also that there are times in your life where time does feel like it's not running in the sort of normal 9 to 5 routine. Like, when you have a baby, and you meet your baby, and you feel like you've known them forever, even though they've only just been born. Or when somebody dies and there's a kind of feeling of the timelessness of grief, or the kind of strange alien sensation of the way in which grief affects us. And so the poem is quoted for those reasons, I think, and also because the book is interested in the way that time can kind of fold back on itself. Certain important things in your life can kind of come to meet each other, even though they are not adjacent in time. So there's a kind of metaphorical, philosophical, and actually a sort of scientific basis to wanting to explore that. So the book is partly about grief and grieving and how that distorts time. And also, on a more sci-fi level, how there might be something going on in the book where time is kind of doing some strange things to Morgan in particular, the present day character, the son of Dolores. So yeah,
this is probably a good point to sort of ask you, where how did the headland sort of come to be? Like what was it? You've kind of mentioned the influences, but how did all of that kind of come together into a book, and into this particular book? I mean, was it that you saw the diary, or did you see the kind of idea of this, of kind of Morgan going back and sort of dealing with what he had to deal with, or were there other scenes that kind of became very central, or did it emerge some other way entirely?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I do think your memory distorts a bit when you start writing a book, because it's quite a long time from beginning to write a book to it being published. I think about 4 years in this case, a bit longer than normal because of the pandemic kind of interrupting everything. But no, I'll tell you what the original spark was, and it probably sounds a bit weird in some ways, but I wanted to write a book about motherhood and newborns, and how weird newborns are, and how alien they are, actually. But there's so many amazing books about that subject, especially in the sort of emerging in the last 5 to sort of 8 years. That are kind of literally about that, and it's such a wonderful kind of, almost like a genre that's springing up around that. I thought, well, people are doing this and they're doing it well, and I don't know if I need to do it as well. And I thought, well, actually, what about literally writing about an alien? How might that be? And for my sort of brain, that was a much more appealing idea, actually, because it's so crazy, and I sort of quite like those very off the wall ideas. And I thought, again, there are a lot of really great alien narratives in popular culture and in science fiction, but I thought, what about doing an alien narrative where the alien is truly other? We're not given a easy way of communicating with it. There's as little anthropomorphization as possible. Obviously, you have to have a compromise, because you can't have a book where your reader cannot relate at all to what's happening in the book. So you can't completely get out of that paradigm, that paradox. But I thought, what about an alien that doesn't learn to speak, doesn't learn to communicate in any straightforward way, seems to require a form of care, wants to kind of build a relationship with the protagonist, but it's all very kind of strange. And that became a kind of writerly challenge. How do you do that and still make it a book that people can read and want to be interested in? So that was the spark of the idea. How do I create this relationship between this alien being and this character, and retain this radical sense of otherness in the alien? So I started with that. I had already been reading a bit of the Ravelli, and I started thinking about time, and I thought, that's really interesting. And then I thought, I'm quite drawn to kind of coastal landscapes. And I thought, I want it to be a coastal landscape. I live in the north, I live in York. And I was thinking about a northern kind of coastal place. But then I visited Dungeness. I hadn't visited it before. And I sort of was confronted with this really unusual, fascinating landscape where, as I say, 2 power stations, very small, kind of quite artistic community. It's a landing spot for refugees because it's quite close to, you can see on a clear day, you can see France across the water, it's that close. And I visited with my husband and my little boy at the time. And I just thought, this is weird, this place, and it's a weird enough place to set the novel. And then I learned more about Prospect Cottage, the Jarman cottage, and more about him. And then I read his diary, Modern Nature. And then it started to come together as an idea. I sort of used that as an inspiration for Dolores. And then I decided to set it in the late 80s because that's when Jarman's diary is set. Although I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to set it after the Great Storm of 1987, which if you certainly if you lived in the south of England in the late 1980s, would be in your memory as a kind of quite dramatic, natural phenomenon. So some people listening might remember it, some people won't, depending on how old they are and where they live in the world or where they live in the country. But there was a big hurricane in 1987. It didn't kill many people because it happened about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning when most people are not outside. So that was lucky in some respects, but it caused quite a lot of destruction. It was very dramatic. And I thought this would be a really interesting beginning to start this book during that storm and the aftermath of the storm. So Violet the alien kind of emerges out of that storm. And also I was just really interested in the drama of the storm as a thing. The book is also, there's a little echo of Shakespeare's The Tempest, which is, of course, capped by storm. And so all these different elements came together, I guess. The Ravelli and the Jarman and the Shakespeare and the actual real live place, that kind of, there's no substitute for experiencing a landscape and writing about it, an evocative landscape like Dungeness. So I did fictionalize it a little bit because then I thought I can take some liberties with it if I do that. But it's very close to the real landscape of Dungeness. It doesn't actually really depart from it that much. So yeah. Mm-hmm. That's how it started. And then I just kind of really tried to inhabit Dolores's point of view, and tried to remember what it was like in the late 80s when I was still quite young. So yeah, I could sort of just about remember. But the great thing about the late 80s is we didn't have the internet and we didn't have mobile phones. And so it's much more fun to write when those things aren't available. Because your character can't go onto Google and look things up or phone anyone on a mobile phone. So it's from a narrative point of view, like mobile phones and the internet have really ruined the possibilities of narrative. The amount of movies where you have to have, the mobile phone signal is blocked, no one can phone. Otherwise the movie doesn't work or the story doesn't work. So the late 80s offered quite nice artistic freedom in that sense. She has to go to the library at one point to look up what she thinks this alien might be. She can't just go on Google and look for it. And when all the phone lines and everything are down, which they were in 1987 after the storm, there's no TV, there's no radio, there's no phone signal, so no one can communicate with anyone. And that is dramatically much more interesting for a narrative. So, yeah.
So interesting to think about, just how much has changed. Funnily enough, it was a podcast with Una McCormack and talking about another writer who'd written some crime novels, Eric Brown, and he'd set them, I believe, at a time before mobile phones and the internet, and we were kind of talking about how just sort of crime novels in particular have been utterly altered by the creation of cell phones, mobile phones. And Una McCormack is a great connection to Gold SF, which is where the Headland kind of found a home. And how what was the process there? How did this book end up at that imprint?
Well, I think it was definitely looking for a home. And in my head, I initially saw the call from Gold SF, one of the early calls for proposals for books. And I thought, I'm not sure this novel is sci-fi enough for this imprint. I hadn't really written it thinking I'm writing a sci-fi. Una knows this, so I hadn't really written it going I'm writing a sci-fi. And in my mind, it was sort of a kind of more of a poetic, sort of strange, almost like magical realist sort of thing, I suppose. Yes, it does have this alien being in it, but in terms of like the tradition of the sci-fi novel, it didn't feel sci-fi enough, I suppose. But then I went to an online conference because I am interested in speculative fiction, just sort of anyway. And I went to an online conference, and Gold SF gave a kind of panel talk and I think a launch of a couple of their earlier titles. And they were talking about the sort of philosophy of the press and the sorts of things they're interested in. And I realised listening to them that it was much more sort of welcoming of more unusual sort of genre blending books than I had originally realised. Then I sort of went back to their proposal page and looked at like what they were interested in, and I thought, yes, it does have a kind of political angle to it with this refugee sort of part of the narrative, and it's trying to explore a kind of feminine experience or a female experience. So I just thought, I'll give it a go, and wrote the proposal and sent them a sample, which I think was 50 pages or something like that. And they were really keen, and they said, send us the rest of it, and sort of the rest is history, I suppose. And what I think is really interesting about science fiction is that it's often a very welcoming community, in the sense that I think sometimes there's a bit of snobbery in the literary world about science fiction, but that snobbery doesn't go the other way. I don't think science fiction is snobby about literary fiction, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, it does completely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, we are seeing more sci-fis like winning the big prizes like the Booker or being longlisted or whatever. Like in Ascension, the Martin McInnes is quite an interesting example of what I would call it's quite a sci-fi book, really, that. And it did get on some kind of literary, inverted commas, long lists. Mm-hmm. But 10 years ago, you wouldn't really have seen that, I don't think, so much. So, and if you look at like the Arthur C. Clarke Award, they're often very kind of, arguably more speculative than science fiction, in a sense, starting with The Handmaid's Tale and then, the Colson Whitehead, The Underground Railroad and things like that. They're not what you call hardcore science fiction or necessarily what you'd associate. So there's a real openness in that community that doesn't maybe work the other way, which is what I really like about it. So yeah, and then working with them has just been just a joy. They're just wonderful to work with, and I think just that mission of getting more female writers or feminist texts into that community is a great is a great thing to be doing, I think, as well. Obviously, it's always good to represent women more if they're underrepresented. So,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah, it's developing into a really, really interesting list. Lots of fascinating things on the way.
Yeah, I mean, the fact they publish poetry, the fact that they publish short stories, I think the Pippa Goldschmidt collection that's come out recently, Schrodinger's Wife, is brilliant. Yeah, it's brilliant. It's a really good. I'm very proud to be part of that list, and that the Headland found a home in that list. And then it felt like it feels like a very natural home for it now. I don't really know what I was worried about in the first place, but that's how writers are. We don't always know where our work belongs, I don't think. Yeah.
Going back to influences, you've mentioned Ravelli already, and you mentioned kind of Prospect Cottage, but at the end of the book, you also mentioned John Carpenter and Alice Oswald. And I don't know Oswald's poetry very well, but I took a little look, and I sensed the influence of poems like Hymn to Iris, and there's that beautiful line, quick moving goddess of the rainbow, which you kind of nod to, and there's another line which is just a beautiful line. May I often wake on the broken bridge of a word, and I wonder kind of how did you've talked about Ravelli, but Carpenter, Oswald, you mentioned Nicholas Roeg, all of those. You took the time to kind of mention those at the end of the book, and I wonder, looking back, how did they all slot into place for you?
Yeah, it's quite an eclectic list of people in a way.
Very eclectic.
Yeah. So my brain is very. I think I would say probably I'm quite neurodiverse in the sense that I my brain makes connections sort of all over the shop with all sorts of things and doesn't really have any boundaries. So so Alice Oswald I came to when I started writing poetry more seriously, and I just think she's an amazing poet. And again, kind of otherness. Excuse me. So she manages to make quite ordinary things like the iris flower, which of course is not ordinary, it's extraordinary, but we don't think of it that way, into these kind of very strange others, and she has a whole collection actually called Weeds and Wild Flowers, which is about flowers, where she sort of turns them into personas. And it's actually very strange and kind of dark. And she creates these really unusual voices for all these weeds and flowers. And it's just her way of looking at the world is so unusual and so strange, but it just really appealed to me when I first discovered her with her first collection, which is called The Thing in the Gapstone Style, which she probably thinks of as juvenilia at this point in her career. She's been Oxford Professor of Poetry and, all sorts of amazing things. But I think it's just a paradigm shifting collection. And it just made me think, like you can write about things, a bit like that book I mentioned at the beginning that I read as a child. You can write about things in this way that sort of brings them to life, where, one wouldn't even notice a daisy growing out of a cracked paving slab, but she would, and she'd give it this whole mythical life. And so I think in writing about the alien and writing about Violet, there's a kind of poetics to that. I wanted to kind of go, here's this really weird being, try and write about her or it or they, in a way that makes the reader experience it, but doesn't resolve it. It isn't comparable to anything else that exists. So that's why Alice Oswald is name checked, I suppose. Carpenter for Starman, which is a movie about an alien, which probably comes over as quite cheesy to some people. It's Jeff Bridges. It's late 70s, I think, and maybe early 80s. But the reason I love that alien film is that it's about grief. It's very unapologetically and even unmetaphorically about a grieving widow. And this alien appears one night and takes the form of her dead husband, and she's not very happy about it initially. She's like, what the hell? And she sort of falls in love with him. She knows it's not her husband because he acts really weird. He looks like a husband, but he acts like an alien. He doesn't know what Earth is. He doesn't know why he's there or whatever. But the film ends up being kind of about her working through her unresolved grief through her relationship with him. And that's kind of what Dolores is doing through her relationship with Violet in the book. She's working through this sort of the kind of alien invasion that grief can be for I think is for many people. Like she has this unresolved kind of tragic thing that's happened, and we don't really know what it is until near the end of the novel, so I won't give it away, but we know something bad has happened to her. And Violet becomes a kind of manifestation of that, or a way of her dealing with it through a kind of connection. She's struggling to connect with people for various reasons, and that becomes a way of connecting for her, and a way of kind of coming back into the world, I suppose. Nicholas Roeg, the film Don't Look Now. I don't know if you've seen Don't Look Now.
I have. Sorry, I have. Yes.
You have. Well, I think most of us probably have. And are just totally traumatized by it, obviously.
Not recently, but I have. Yeah.
So it's sort of a thriller / horror, and it's based on a Daphne du Maurier short story of the same name, although I think the film is much more interesting in many respects. But the reason I love that film, it's a horror. People will see it as a horror, and it's set in a, off-season Venice, which is creepy already. Really, off-season Venice is a creepy location.
Yes,
sort of watery location again. But it plays with the visual in a really interesting way. Essentially, tells you what's going to happen in the first scene. With Donald Sutherland's character is looking at a slide, and he spills some red ink on it, and that slide and that ink tells you all you need to know about the whole film. But of course, you don't really read it that way. But once you've watched the film a couple of times, you realise it's what we'd call now an Easter egg, I think. But we didn't then. But that film is also about grief. We have a death at the beginning, a tragic death, and the whole film is really kind of spins out from that moment, that the kind of impact, the sort of deferred effect of that moment. So that's another reason why Roeg is mentioned, and films like those kinds of films are quite strong influence on me, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I was hoping you'd talk about Roeg, because I think Roeg is really
yeah.
Roeg is really interesting, and but also with Roeg, just the layering in things like Walkabout and the foreshadowing and the way narrative seems to be echoing back and forth.
Yes,
I definitely kind of felt, okay, that's maybe, with the Headland, that's something which you were tapping into on some level.
Yeah, and I think with Don't Look Now in particular, there is a sense that things not happening when they're happening, they've already happened. But I mean, you've got the famous sex scene, haven't you, obviously, in Don't Look Now, which you see them afterwards, during, and during the way it's cut. But of course, the bit where she's putting her lipstick on afterwards and she's kind of thinking back to it, of course, she is there in that moment, but she's also back in that other moment. And it is, as you say, that kind of layering of we're not always in the present. We are sometimes in the past, and we are sometimes sort of weirdly in our own futures, and those things can kind of exist simultaneously. And he does that visually, which I really love. He actually is doing that, presenting that to us in a visual form, and that's not possible in quite the same way in writing. I think you can try to replicate it, but it's not yeah, but as you say, he's almost playing with time in the way he edits his films, because the beginning of Don't Look Now inscribes the ending. We've seen the ending. We already know. We kind of unconsciously put it to one side, but it's already happened. There's no getting around it, and then we just need to kind of get there, I suppose, in a sense. There's the moment, isn't there, where he sees his own funeral boat before he dies, on the canal, so with a film, you can kind of actually do that thing with time where you're in a different time, or you're seeing a different time. So I think that's kind of structural thing was very interesting to me for the writing as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. A year before the Headland came out, you edited Blood and Cord, and you've talked a bit about motherhood already.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about that book, and how did you find the process of editing it, and also are there kind of sinew? I mean, there must be, but the connections between Blood and Cord and the Headland in your mind?
Yeah, so that was a really interesting project. So I've been interested for a while in the sort of early parenthood. And I put together with a friend of mine who's a psychologist a series of workshops with parents who had children under 3. So we're really interested in the relationship between creative writing as a kind of expressive thing and working through the experience of early parenthood, which I think is a really sort of profound transformative process for a lot of people, and an ambivalent one as well. And I don't think culture really acknowledges how much having a child, particularly your first child, just sort of blows apart your identity. And some people find that really difficult, and some people find it really joyful, and some people, a combination of all these different complex sort of emotions. And then out of that project, we also commissioned 18 writers to respond essentially to a very simple brief, which was to write a piece in any form about early parenthood. So that's what Blood and Cord is. They were all writers that I admire greatly, that I knew were interested in writing about early parenthood, or who already had done so. So I commissioned 18 people, and they all wrote very different things about their experience of early parenthood. And the MYY Press, who are an amazing small press, Emma Wright runs the press. She's absolutely brilliant. We collaborated with her, and she was really keen to publish it. And it's a really interesting book because I think it's quite a strong book. I sort of said to writers, I'm not going to sort of inhibit you in any way. You can write about this experience in any way you want, because the whole point of this is that there's a kind of element of taboo in our culture around how we write about early parenthood. And I'm not going to say, oh no, I don't want you to write about anything that's too difficult or too unpalatable or whatever. I want you to write what I gave them a word limit out of necessity, but it's like, I want you to write what you want to write. And they're all very good writers already, professional writers. I just sort of said it needs to not be too academic. It needs to be something that anyone can pick up and read and access, but not dumbed down in any way either. And what we got was just a really eclectic, really interesting mix of pieces of writing, some poems, some short stories, some kind of non-fiction pieces. And from some really great writers. So we've got Gail McConnell in there, Caleb Claces, Daisy Hildyard, Naomi Booth, Rebecca Goss, Janine Bradbury. There's loads of amazing people in the book. And yes, the process of editing a book it's quite time consuming, but they were already such good writers. Many of them didn't really need a lot of feedback. They had already presented me with very high quality work, and it's gone down quite well. I think a lot of people have responded to it and said, thank God somebody's expressed what I was thinking, but I thought was an unacceptable way of thinking about my parenthood, or thinking about my birth, or thinking about the loss of my baby, or whatever it might be. I think it made people feel that they weren't alone in having those more complex, more ambivalent feelings about what early parenthood is like. So no, it was a good experience doing that book. Yeah, for sure.
And we don't want to spoil the headland, but yeah, I'm definitely having read the headland, I'm kind of intrigued to read some of that, some of Blood and Cord, because you mentioned sort of like it being a strong book, and there are some incredibly strong moments, some very strong kind of moments to do with motherhood, some very strong moments to do with also some really strong speculative moments, so incredibly visual. You pull off some amazing kind of pyrotechnics with the way you look at the way you're looking at kind of time, and the way you're looking at kind of perception and all of this. So it definitely left an impact. It kind of left an impression on me. What was I going to ask you next? You also teach creative writing, and I wonder kind of how do you find that your teaching your process of teaching and your work with students, how does that inform your own writing, and also how does your approach to writing help you teach students? I mean, they kind of go in a circle, I imagine.
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a really good question. And I try all the time to think about how am I sort of teaching creative writing. I mean, I suppose a better word for it is probably facilitating, isn't it? Because you can't really. But increasingly, I've probably been teaching for about 20 years or something now. And increasingly, I'm suspicious of like sort of set ways of teaching creative writing. And there are kind of traditional things that you find in the kind of creative writing workshop. Even the workshop itself, and the way in which we share work with one another and critique each other's work, I'm beginning to kind of rethink in some ways, or have, from experience with students, kind of think differently about even how that works. But, for example, the students are often taught these traditional plot structures, like the hero's journey or the climax resolution, the triangle, the Freytag's triangle, and sort of set ways of, this will make a good narrative, or this will make a good poem. And increasingly, I'm sort of suspicious of those kinds of, that they can be useful. I think they can be really useful. There's a really interesting book that came out recently by Jane Allison called Meander, Spiral, Explode, which is a really wonderful exploration of form and plot structure in narrative, where she argues, we've got all these very sort of pattern-based plot structures that we tend to encourage students to use. But in fact, it's quite interesting to look at like natural forms, like the shape of a shell, or the way that a wave crashes on the beach and recedes, or the way something unfolds, like a leaf unfolds, and how we can actually use those kinds of structures as well to think about plot and narrative. And she has some really good examples, like Marguerite Duras's The Lover, she describes as a kind of spiraling narrative. We don't move forward in a traditional way. We keep coming back to memories and the past and impressions. And that's a wonderful novella. It works beautifully. So increasingly, I try to encourage students to kind of follow their own noses in terms of what creatively they want to be doing, and find their own voices and find their own ways of structuring their work, rather than trying to impose on them, well, this works well as a plot, or this is the way you write a character. And I think it comes about through reading their drafts, working with them, and trying to bring out what that particular piece of work wants to be, rather than trying to fit it into some sort of model of what we think writing should look like. So one thing I really try to do in my teaching is to encourage confidence, like creative confidence. People are often anxious and fearful about their own creativity. And it's sort of trusting your own creativity and how you might allow that to sort of breathe a little bit and flourish. And I will try to find the sort of kernel of what a piece of writing is trying to do and say to the student, look, there's something really good here. Let's bring this out of the writing. I encourage people to read a lot. I mean, this is the other thing that I think sometimes doesn't happen as much as it should, that the more students read of, particularly contemporary writing, the more they see how other people do things. They kind of get a sense of what people are reading and what's out there, if they want to be published, and allow those things to kind of compost in their minds and to come out as what their version of what they want to do might be. But increasingly, I don't think there's a kind of particular way, like a way that fits everybody. Everybody's brain works differently, as we're learning, aren't we, that some people are really neurodiverse and some people are less so, and some people work well in certain ways and not in others. And just allowing people to explore their creativity, I think, is really important. And then it's sort of my job to kind of catch the best bits of that and say to them, look, here's a bit here that wants to be told. This is your story, or this is your emotion that you want to explore, and helping them to bring it out, I think.
Facilitating, nurturing.
Yeah. I think it takes a while to kind of get an instinct for doing it, though. It takes a little bit of time and meeting students and kind of actively listening to them. Confidence can definitely be an issue, I think, with writers, is they don't believe in themselves maybe as much as they should. So before they've even got off the ground, they are curtailing their own creativity. Oh, this is mad. This is crazy. I shouldn't write this. It's weird. It doesn't fit in with other things. And actually, sometimes those are the best things. So it's trying to give them that confidence, I think, to some extent. And I think writing is a community as well. I think it's about supporting other writers. It's about going to events. It's about reading reviews and reading other people's work and supporting. You're not on your own writing in a vacuum. You're kind of writing in a community. I think in the sci-fi community, you really feel that. And in the poetry community, you really feel that. Poets wouldn't exist really without other poets going to readings and buying their books. It's true.
It's sadly, but
yeah. There is a statistic, isn't there, that more people write poetry than buy it. But they want their own poetry to be bought. So,
yeah, there is.
Get out there and read and listen to other poets and buy their books.
Yeah, for sure. There is definitely, I think, certainly in speculative fiction and I think in poetry, the submissions vastly kind of outnumber the sales.
Yeah.
Earlier, you said that you're kind of rethinking your approach to sort of feedback and rethinking your approach to kind of how maybe. You mean how you give students feedback, or how students give each other feedback, or is it to do with what you mentioned just now, that you're seeing that kind of different students require different types of feedback, and that kind of maybe workshops don't always work for everybody?
Yeah, I think so. So I think we've sort of inherited a slightly, possibly even watered down version of the kind of Iowa workshop model. So the famous Iowa creative writing course, which is still one of the most prestigious in the world, where you read each other's work and you sit around and you kind of give a critique, and the writer's not allowed to say anything. And, I think that's a really interesting model, and it is quite useful because you've got, a group of people who are your would-be readers responding to your work. but there is a book that came out quite recently by Matthew Salesses called Craft in the Real World, which critiques that model because he says it's, you know, it's very white, it's very middle class, it's very privileged. If you are from a kind of minority group, not being allowed to speak, for example, and defend your work can be very demeaning. What works as an image for someone from a particular culture doesn't work for someone from another one. There's lots of assumptions made that there's a kind of baseline of what is a cliche or what is a good image or what is a good plot or what is a good character. So I think that's quite interesting. And yeah, so I kind of try to think about feedback again as a sort of responsive thing where it's not you're reading someone's work and you're not necessarily saying, oh well, this could be a sonnet, but it isn't one, or you know, this is written in a particular kind of genre, but doesn't follow the genre's rules, but instead you're kind of going, what is this particular piece of writing uniquely aiming to try to do? What is its emotional truth? Maybe sometimes I might start with that actually. What's the heart of this piece of writing? Which sounds potentially not very postmodern ever, but and bring out the strengths and bring out what a piece of writing wants to be on its own terms, rather than saying it doesn't fit with this or it doesn't fit with that or it doesn't follow this pattern. Because I think everyone has something sort of unique to offer. So I tend to kind of look for what a piece of writing is telling me it wants to be and bring it out. And then obviously look for really great phrases in it or really great images or really great ideas that just feel like they work really well. And it comes back to the large as sparrow's eggs and as warm as tea. You know, it comes back to that.
Right.
Every time in a weird sort of way. If you can give someone that feeling, that I'm always really interested in, like a piece of writing, giving the reader an experience rather than telling the reader about an experience, actually making them feel that they're having an experience, if that makes sense. There's a subtle difference between being on a roller coaster and looking at a roller coaster, standing on the ground, watching it going around. And it's like, can you get your reader onto the roller coaster in the way that you write, rather than just describing it from not being on it, you know? So yeah, it's about really sort of actively responding to what the writing is trying to tell you it wants to do. And I think sometimes that also means asking the writer, like, what were you trying to do here? Not saying you have to be silent for all of your feedback, you know, actually maybe let's talk about what you wanted to do and what your challenges have been. And it's a process as well. I think writing's a process. It doesn't always yield any result. But that doesn't mean the process itself is not valuable later on down the line.
Yeah. All of that is fantastic. I mean, advice in a sense. And my next question was about kind of advice, but I think you've already given you've already said so many things which can be parsed as advice. I was looking at an interview. I was looking at an old interview with Anne Sexton, and she was asked for advice for young writers, and she said, "Be careful who your critics are," which I think is wonderful, and then be specific, which is kind of fascinating, and tell almost the whole story, and then put your ear close down to your soul and listen hard. And as you were talking, I was sort of hearing little bits of that sort of resonating through what you were saying. So yeah, I
definitely think understanding what not to say in your writing, what to leave silent, is really important. And I often say that to my students. It's the gaps and the absences and the silences in your writing is where your reader can enter the text and participate in the text. And readers like doing that. So it's about manipulating the things you've decided that you know as a writer, but you decided not to actually put on the page. Like lace. Lace is beautiful because it's got holes in it. Too many holes, it falls apart. Not enough holes, it ceases to be lace. So it's a bit like that. If you can make your writing like beautiful lace, you're manipulating the holes as well as the substance.
When you're writing, are you revising a lot, and is that revision, is a lot of that revising cutting?
So it's interesting because I think as you get better practiced at editing, you start doing it preemptively almost. But yeah, I think usually with a novel, it probably goes through about 7 drafts for me. My first novel went through some quite substantial redrafting, like really significant sort of changes to the story. Water and Glass, probably about 3 significant, like substantial drafts where I was sort of tearing my hair out trying to get it to work, and then another maybe 4 or 5 sort of more editing style drafts. I think with the Headland, it was a little bit. It came a little bit more easily, and I think that's probably because of the sort of diary format of Dolores's narrative and the sort of naturalness of that. It felt to me, and actually, it still went through quite a significant number of drafts, but not loads of actual changes. I think the story itself was simpler. I think when you're writing a novel, I think it's probably better if you can make your story slightly more simple, like simpler than you think it should be. Because I think there's that impulse with writing a novel of like, oh, it's a novel, it's a big thing and it needs to have loads going on. In fact, it sometimes works better to not have loads going on. So no, actually, it didn't. Neither of those edits involved lots of cutting. They actually involved adding a little bit, sort of developing a little bit in certain points in the narrative, like expanding a scene or giving a character a bit more airtime. With shorter things like short stories and poems, there's a lot of cutting. I think there's a lot of like making everything count, everything as precise as possible. I think the novel's slightly looser as a form. But yeah, there's quite a lot of editing involved, and I think a good writing always is edited quite a lot, and I think it can. Some writers think, "Oh God, I hate editing; it's horrible," but I think actually it can be quite a creative process, because I think, like, going back to that point about teaching before, it's about listening to what the work wants you to do with it and going, okay, push some of this into the background and bring some of this forward. This is the important stuff. Bring it forward a bit. So I quite like the editing process. It's quite satisfying once you've got a full draft of something to know that you've got most of it down, and it's just a question of editing it or kind of bringing in some extra things. The writing a novel, the beginning of writing a novel is quite intimidating, because you're like, I've just started this thing and I've got 60,000 words to go, or whatever it might be. And I think the process of kind of composing it is quite. The reason I quite like writing novels is because you really begin to immerse yourself in the world, and you revisit that world, hopefully most days for a few months. You're kind of going back to it every morning and back in the world, and it does something quite strange to your brain. It's almost like you're living in a fantasy. Whereas with short fiction and poems, you're only in those worlds for a short time and you don't immerse yourself in quite the same way. So, but yeah, editing is good. If people are listening who are writers, the editing process is really important, I think.
And do you go back to your work a lot because after it's finished, in terms of once you know that the kind of it's out in the world, or because you've left that world, that world that you were immersed in, you've now moved on from. I remember talking to Leah Whiteley, and she was talking about how generally she's once the book is done, it's kind of there, but it's in the past, and she's there's always something else ahead of her, or so, in front of her. Is that what you find? Is the headland kind of has it kind of already receded a little bit into the memory?
Well, it's a funny thing because you often finish a book quite a while before it actually comes out. Once it's accepted by it might be a while before it's accepted by a publisher, and then it's accepted by a publisher, and then you kind of go back to it and might do some editing with them on the book. Then it might be a year before it actually comes out, and then you have to do the kind of launching it and talking about it. So it has these different lives. There's the bit where you're writing it, and it might be that 3 or 4 years later you're talking about it. And and so I mean, that's quite a long, but 2 years later you might be talking about something you finished 2 years ago. Essentially, creatively, you finished. So you kind of have to go back and remember the process and live in the book again, so that you can do readings and you can talk to people and promote it and stuff. So that can be quite weird. But I think with the headland, like, for me, it was. I feel like it's the best thing that I've written so far, and that's quite a good feeling, because you kind of, the last thing you wrote maybe ought to be the best thing you wrote in a way. It doesn't always work like that, but there's something important about this book to me. Like, it feels important to my life in some way that I can't maybe totally put my finger on. So I don't necessarily think I will ever be like, oh, that's just a thing I wrote ages ago and I'm not interested in it anymore. I don't think that. I think it's kind of a present. It kind of got in my soul a bit when I was writing it, I suppose. So it's there, it's there. But yes, I also think it's healthy to move on and start thinking about whatever the next thing is that you want to write, and sometimes that is happening whilst you're still talking about and promoting a book that's just come out. It's good to have different things on the go and not to get too obsessed with one thing, I think, and just to keep your mind sharp. And yeah, so, but I guess in some ways all of these things have a relationship to one another. They're part of you as a creative person evolving, So I'm sure that some of my poetry has bled into some of my fiction. I'm sure that, it's the same person writing, it's all writing, it's all process, I guess.
Yeah. Last question before we go, because I don't want to keep you too long, but Gold SF Gold SF talks about promoting voices that are, quoting from the site, answering to the unprecedented times in which we find ourselves now living. And certainly, for the second time today, I've been talking to someone about unprecedented times. But which voices in poetry and prose are you kind of paying close attention to at the moment? And are there, who do you think is sort of answering to these times in a really interesting way? Maybe some recommendations for people listening.
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so one of my colleagues and friends, Vibar Cregan-Reid, has written an amazing book about the power of reading. It's called We Are What We Read. And it's really about, it's a kind of semi-memoir, but it's also about, government cuts to the arts and humanities, the threat to libraries, and the power of books, really. So that's a non-fiction, but it's really, really wonderful read, and it feels very important to be talking about the importance of reading and the erosion of reading. There's a couple of really good books coming out from Kim Campanello, who works at the University of Leeds. And she's got a poetry book coming out with Bloomsbury called An Interesting Detail, and a novel coming out called Use the Words You Have in June. And the poetry book is, I think, going to be quite an important book. And Use the Words You Have is a kind of, I mentioned Marguerite Duras earlier. It's a sort of contemporary Marguerite Duras narrative set in France. It's kind of very sexy, very interesting, sort of your entertaining, sexy, intellectual summer book for your summer holiday, which I think is really important. I think that's important to kind of have that visceral kind of connection to your summer book. And then I also mentioned Naomi Booth, who has is, I think, an amazing writer. Her most recent novel just came out, and it's called Raw Content. It's out with Corsair. It literally came out like a couple of weeks ago. And we mentioned Blood and Cord, and she has a piece in Blood and Cord, but Raw Content is about that experience of early motherhood. And the main character in Raw Content has a very extreme experience of early motherhood, extreme anxiety. And it's partly about that, and it's partly about kind of northern landscapes and kind of the vulnerability of being a mother to a young baby. So that's part of that, as I mentioned earlier, that kind of genre of early parenthood books that I think has really kind of expanded in recent years and is really important. So those three, so Vibar Cregan-Reid, Kimberly Campanello and Naomi Booth are big recommendations from me. So very exciting writers.
Thank you for those. I'll make sure to add those to the notes as well. So they sound like great recommendations. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today, Abi. It's been a real pleasure. You're
so welcome. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed talking about all that stuff. I'm glad that I managed to remember why I had included certain things. But yeah. Why Nicholas Roeg?
Why Nicholas Roeg? The Headland is available wherever books are sold, and it came out. It was last year, so I got to it a little bit late. And Gold SF. Anyone listening, who hasn't checked out the list, do check it out, because it's I saw something. Every time I check the list, there's something new on there which looks interesting. So yeah, so Gold SF is worth looking at.
Yeah. It's exciting, Gold SF. There's a couple of new titles coming out. I think The Moon is coming out soon. And Schrodinger's Wife, great poetry collection. Short story collection. Check it out if you haven't checked it out already, because it's a really exciting list, I think.
You've been listening to Interzone Pod with me, Gareth Jelley, and my guest today, Abi Curtis. Find out more about Interzone at interzone.press and read stories for free at interzone.digital. Thanks for listening. See you next time.